Right, hi everyone. Thanks. Thanks, Sammy, for the introduction. And great to be here again. So I'm also really going to tee up the rest of these talks and speak a little bit about what's the case for these advanced interventions that everyone seems to know us for. And I think if you haven't had anything to do with London's Air Ambulance or haven't worked for us or with us, and you just read what we publish or the talks we give, you would have that image that it's all about Reboa and thoracotomy. But what always, I think, surprises the people who come and work for us, and we have a lot of people who come and work for us, brilliant doctors from all over the world. We get a new one every month. It's great fun. But I think what surprises them when they arrive is they're expecting to do that stuff, and they do it. But I think what gets them is the amount of focus and devotion that we spend on making sure that they can do the basics right. And often their feedback to us is, we didn't realize you were going to be so on the detail on how to even examine someone. I mean, I'm a consultant and you were teaching me how to examine a patient and how to make decisions. And we do pride ourselves on spending a lot of time teaching the basics, because you need a very strong basics platform to do any of this other stuff that we're going to talk about today. And you need a good data to drive these kind of the need for these interventions. So that's what I'm going to talk a bit about. Whenever I'm going to present some data, it's our unit's data, but I didn't put it all together. There's usually a big team. Mostly, Aditi was my academic fellow during this work, and she worked tirelessly for about a year, chasing forensic pathologists, chasing the police, chasing all the different major trauma centers we work in to put this data together, which is really helpful for us. So I'm going to start, really, this is right at the beginning of trauma care. You would all come across this. This is Donald Trunke and his team's work on the trimodal distribution of deaths. This was probably one of the first population-based studies of deaths in a region. It was in San Francisco. They did autopsies on everyone who died for a period of a year. About just over 400 people died. And they looked at why people died and when they died. And the when turned into this trimodal death distribution that I'm sure you've all heard of. It's in ATLS and has been forever. And there's a few things on this. The first thing I want to say is that kind of research, this epidemiological research, is so important to setting up systems of care. And this led directly to organized trauma care across the world, but certainly that's what started it off in America. The second thing to know is that these kind of research works are actually incredibly rare. No one does it. It's a big effort to try and get everyone who's died across a region in a period of time. And that causes a lot of problems in our research, because the vast majority is hospital-based. And that really causes a big survival bias. It excludes a lot of deaths, and we just focus in on what's right in front of us, and we don't actually see what else is going on in the bigger picture. Anyway, so that was in the 1970s, and after that, America developed organized trauma systems. And about 20 years later, Dimitriades and his team in Los Angeles repeated a very similar study over 3 years, so a lot more patients, about 4,000 patients, and they looked at the same thing. And what they found was that third peak had gone. And this is because, really, of the effectiveness of those trauma systems. That you got patients into organized trauma systems, and those late deaths disappeared, and actually the early deaths started dropping. But what you probably notice, if I can find it, is still 50% of these deaths were happening before patients even got into hospital. Now, this is our London. As Sammy said, it's a big urban city, about 10 million people. We, since 2010, have had an organized, inclusive trauma system across the whole of London. And that's one single ambulance service that organizes all the pre-hospital care, 4 big level 1 major trauma centers and about 22 smaller trauma units. And embedded in that system is London's Air Ambulance. We dispatched by the ambulance service, and we mainly target major trauma. We have staggered shifts so that there's usually 2 teams on when it's busy. And I think we do a really good job at getting to almost all the major trauma that happens in London. Our dispatching miss rate is less than 0.5%. Okay. And we audit that monthly. Our operational miss rate, where everyone's busy and we can't get to somewhere where we need it, is about 6 to 8%. Okay. So we're seeing over 90% of the major trauma in London. So what we wanted to do, and what I'm going to show you, is we wanted to have a look at all the deaths that occurred in this London trauma system across a 2-year period. So everyone who died across 2 years, we tracked them down, all their autopsy reports. If they died in hospital, we got all the records from the hospital, and we put it all together. And overall, over 2 years, we saw just over 3,000 patients, so 1,500 patients a year. And out of those 3,500 people ultimately died from their injuries. Okay, that's a lot. That's 1 in 6 people that we were seeing on the air ambulance dies from their injuries. And then we went on, we wanted to see 3 things really. We wanted to see why these people die, where they die, the setting they die in, and the timing of their deaths, because that really is all information you need to know to decide how you allocate your resources and where you focus your research attention and your efforts. So the cause of death. So to do this, as I say, lots of it's forensic, so autopsy reports, but also all the surgical findings for the patients who made it to hospital, or all radiological findings if they're CT'd. And any patients that were difficult to figure out, we then had a multidisciplinary team which had forensic pathologists, surgeons, anaesthetists, and we met once a month and discussed these cases and came up with a consensus. And this is what we found. Okay, so for those 500 deaths over 2 years, about 40% of them were due to central nervous system injuries. And nearly the same was due to hemorrhage. Let me get the pointer. Where has it gone? Oh, sorry. Yeah, so there's hemorrhage. Here's the head injuries. This 6% here, that's head injuries and hemorrhage mixed together. And the next biggest group, this 8% here, is injuries that we call incompatible with life. These are patients who fit our ambulance services criteria for being able to be declared dead. I won't go through them. They basically decapitation, hemicorporectomy, that kind of stuff. Little spattering down the end here of, I've lumped them all together. And the yellow is, I've put it down as ventilatory failure, but it's airway problems, asphyxia, traumatic asphyxia, tension pneumothorax, and the cardiac tamponades. And a very small little group over here of multi-organ failure. Now, so that's why people in London died over 2 years. It's not very different to this study. This is really a seminal American study, also a population-based study, one of the few. This is the study that everyone uses to cite the fact that 40% of people die from hemorrhage. And they showed exactly what we showed. About 40% die from brain injuries, 40% from hemorrhage, and about 6% are brain injuries and hemorrhage. And interestingly, it's exactly the same as Donald Trunke showed in the very first study in the 1970s, and the same as what Dimitriades showed in New York. So this hasn't changed. So we didn't show anything new here. Maybe we just showed that people die from the same traumatic reasons across this side of the Atlantic as they do in America. But then we wanted to look at where these deaths actually were happening. And this is where our analysis was interesting. So we classified or defined the place you died as being pre-hospital or in hospital as where you had your first cardiac arrest. And we did this because really your only opportunity, or almost all the opportunity to prevent a death, comes before someone has a cardiac arrest. Once they've had a cardiac arrest, Really, very few people survive. Even if you take them to hospital, they don't do very well. So wherever you had your first cardiac arrest, that's where we defined where you died, because that's where you really need the interventions to prevent that death happening. And this was interesting. So 77% of all the deaths happen during the pre-hospital phase of care, and only 23% happened in the hospital. And then we went a step further. We went and said, okay, are the reasons for dying the same in the two places? There's a lot of assumptions you can make and focusing your efforts. We had a look at that then. So let's start on the bottom one here. This is the in-hospital deaths. So these are people who made it to hospital alive. They hadn't had a cardiac arrest, but they died in hospital. It's overwhelmingly central nervous system injuries, okay, with a tiny bit of people with hemorrhage and a small amount having made multi-organ failure. So just really those three causes in a hospital. And the multi-organ failure is essentially people who've survived the hemorrhage, but then having the cardiogenic failure leading to multiple organ failure. And we'll hear more about how we're tackling that group a little bit later. But when we look at the pre-hospital deaths, significant difference in why people are dying. Okay, nearly half are dying from bleeding, much less dying from brain injury. Obviously, all the people that are not compatible with life were in this group too. But I've ordered the order here from these first few groups are all the things we agree as potentially reversible. So your hypoxia, your tension pneumothoraxes, your cardiac tamponade, your bleeding. And you see when you add all of that up, about just over half of all the deaths pre-hospital are preventable causes, or not preventable, they're like reversible causes is probably the right word. I'm not saying they're all preventable. It might happen long before we can get to these patients and intervene, but they're the kind of things that if we do get there, we know how to treat them. And you compare that to in-hospital, where it's only 6%. So it's almost an order of magnitude difference in how many reversible causes of death you see. And just to drive this home a bit more, if we look at our known reversible causes of traumatic cardiac arrest, so hypoxia, tension pneumothorax, tamponade, and hemorrhage, when we looked at them over this 2 years, so 100% of the deaths from hypoxia occurred during the pre-hospital phase. 100% of tension pneumothorax's deaths occurred in the pre-hospital phase. 100% of tamponades that died in the pre-hospital phase. And 96% of all people who died from hemorrhage died in the pre-hospital phase. And if we look at one particular group we're interested in, as Sammy said, we see a lot of penetrating trauma, between a third and a half of our work. 80% of all the hemorrhage deaths were from penetrating trauma, and 95% of them are dying pre-hospital. So if you're going to die from being stabbed or shot in London, that death is almost certainly going to be happening because of hemorrhage and during the pre-hospital phase. So if we want to do anything about that group, basically if you were stabbed and you got to hospital alive, you made it. And these patients had big vascular injuries, big cardiac injuries. So really, you look at the kind of equipment I have as a trauma surgeon in a hospital to deal with that kind of injury, and then compare it to what I have in the pre-hospital, and it's chalk and cheese. And these are the things that we are working through. And what do we need? We're not seeing the same patients pre-hospital as we do in hospital. So, do we need things that are unique to the pre-hospital phase to be able to save these kind of patients? The final thing we looked at was the timing of these deaths. Now, for the pre-hospital deaths, we timed the timing in minutes, so how many minutes it took until you had a cardiac arrest, and the in-hospital deaths is in days, like how many days were you admitted for before you died. And this is the overall graph. So you can see very similar to that, what Dimitri already showed. So this is the pattern of deaths you see in an organized, well-functioning trauma system. Your deaths are unimodal and very left-shifted early deaths. Everything in the dark gray are the deaths that are happening in the pre-hospital phase, and then the white boxes are the ones happening in hospital. Now, from that very first important study by Trunke and his team, they called that first phase the immediate deaths, and this was usually down to catastrophic brain injuries and disruptions of major arteries. And the assumption is that they happen immediately and they're unfixable. But actually, when we look at it, they don't happen immediately. Like, of course, a few people do die instantly, but most people are alive for some time after the injuries, a few minutes at least. And there's actually quite a group here that die pre-hospital, but they're alive for more than 15 minutes before they arrest. So we feel that certainly that group, and maybe a chunk of this group, is potentially possible for us to get to and make a difference in them. But just those two groups together, if we took that group and a third of that group, a quarter, is more than all the in-hospital deaths added together. The second thing, we had a little bit of a deeper look into part of this. So this is my last graph, but basically what I'm showing here, this Violin plot plots the time from the point you were injured to when you go into cardiac arrest for those pre-hospital deaths, right? So you can see these are where the patients die. And these lines here, that's the median and the intercortical range. And this grey bar is when we arrive as London's Air Ambulance. Okay, that's our median is usually about 20 minutes after injury with our range. And actually there's two things that are important to take away from this picture. One is that trauma deaths happen very early. So the median time here is about 13 minutes after injury that people are going into cardiac arrest. But the other thing is, actually, this is showing how effective we are. When we arrive, hardly anyone arrests anymore. So that's showing how effective, and it's the same for the in-hospital stuff. Once you're in hospital, we don't see those later deaths anymore. It's because, you know, the care we get, that we can actually deliver is effective, and really. So for me, my conclusions from this is where we want to go in the future is getting to patients quicker. If we can just get a little bit quicker, even 3 minutes quicker, all these people are not going to arrest and will potentially survive. Okay? So that's, I think, where we can make the biggest difference. The second thing is to get patients to hospital quicker. We know that if you get patients to hospital in under an hour, they have much better chances of survival. And that's dealing with all this hemorrhage and that and stopping bleeding and how important that is. And finally, we do need pre-hospital interventions that are effective at either preventing or resuscitating traumatic cardiac arrest. And that's what a lot of our work is on, and you'll hear about today. So thank you for your time.